Good afternoon, Benjamin. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lee McWhorter. This is the third Security Foundation section for the class that began on the 13th. Did you have a good Memorial Day weekend, Benjamin?
Yeah, thank you. How about you?
Pretty good, pretty good. We had a good time. Um, Not bad. It was kind of a lighter weekend than some have been, but we cooked out some burgers and honored our fallen heroes in our own way and hung out with some neighbors. So it was good. It was good.
Great.
Well, we only have 3 lessons to cover today. Last week we ended up on lesson 6, talking about the beginnings of the security frameworks, and talked about PCI DSS. I do remember that's where we were last time. And so this is going to be a shorter session. At least this very next lesson is going to be because lesson 7 is security frameworks 2. And basically, you've probably already seen it. I see a nod over there. It basically is a chapter that, if the first chapter, lesson 6, sort of introduced what security frameworks were, how they come from all kinds of regulatory bodies. We use them as sort of the blueprints of how we produce company security postures and policies and procedures. What lesson 7 is kind of this, okay, now that we've kind of given you all that, let's throw a whole bunch more at you.
Right.
And it's not that you have to memorize all of them, but to be honest with you, especially I'm going to list off sort of the main ones. They do show up occasionally, like on a security kind of certification type of test. And it is good to know the sort of, and this is still the tip of the iceberg, but sort of the depth and breadth of the possibilities of some of these types of guidelines that are out there. And so the ISO, which most people sort of colloquially understand as the International Standards Organization, officially their name is just ISO, but anyway, we all call them that, International Standards Organization. They have a 27,000 series of guidelines that deal with cybersecurity. Now they do, as you can imagine, standards on everything: Bluetooth, wireless, manufacturing, just on and on and on. And so, as a matter of fact, I remember being just literally maybe a half mile from Dell headquarters. Helped them with a project years ago that was to be ISO 9000 certified, which is a manufacturing quality standard. And so they put out all kinds of standard, but they have their own cybersecurity standard. And then, of course, there are a number of, at least in America, we have the NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. There's the ETSI, which is the European equivalent of that. And for that matter, most major companies or blocks, if you will, have some organization like this. So China has one, Japan has one, Korea has one, on and on and on. Russia has one ostensibly. And so, depending upon, like I mentioned last week, depending upon where you're doing business, where you go to work, what organization, you may want to look at many of these standards, and sort of pick and choose the best elements. Plus, they actually come with all different kinds of things, funny enough. Some of them will have, PCI DSS is pretty focused. It has a very narrow set of domains that, as I've said last week, it's kind of the bare minimum of what you would consider a cybersecurity policy, and that's sort of what they did. If you're going to do credit cards, you've got to at least do this stuff. And they provide, sort of a fairly well-rounded set of offerings to go with that bare minimum. But then when you start looking at some of the other providers of different standards, they run the gamut. Some of them just have a lot of sort of white papers and recommendations and best practices, but a lot of them actually will include sample documents. I mean, some of these different groups out there will literally have, here's an acceptable use policy. It's templified. It's got blanks, whatever you want to do, you can modify it, and they'll have spreadsheets, maybe, an asset kind of inventory kind of spreadsheet. They might have something to do with, how to calculate various templates for calculating different types of risk management stuff. So in some ways, beyond the sort of very top level obvious, like, okay, I'm a US company, but I do business in Europe. Let's take a look at the European standards. there's arguments that I'm a U.S. company. I don't do business in Europe, at least not now. But I still might want to look at those. One, because I might get some good ideas. I might grow there someday. If we have an online website, then how do you know, right? So people could be
Right.
coming from Europe. So you try to take all that in, but beyond just making sure you're hitting all the checking the boxes of regulatory. Yes, I have business here, so I need to cover this, or I'm in this industry, I need to cover that. There's value in looking and kind of familiarizing yourself with what the different ones offer, because you might think, well, I don't need to look at the XYZ version of this stuff, this country or this block or this industry's group, but they may have some really great spreadsheets. They may have some really great document templates that even if you're not required to use their stuff, it still may be of value to do so.
Mm.
So we have those sort of national and international, like ISO and NIST and ETSI, ETSI, the European one. But then there's also a lot of other groups. And like I said, we really tip the iceberg here, but the ISA, the IEC, these are electrical engineering groups or information, security systems architect groups, whatever. A lot of industry groups. And of course, in various countries, as well as in the States, particularly, you'll see things like, we have certain, and I believe they're mentioned, I don't have them in my notes, but I know they're mentioned in the text at different places, and I think in here, but they're not really regulatory bodies, but we still have to take into account like Sarbanes-Oakley if we're in the financial space, or, almost any space, but all the healthcare regulations, if HIPAA and stuff like that. If we're in that space, obviously FERPA, if we're over here in the education space, and on and on. So it's really important to know, that at least at a high level, some of the big ones, and then, that there is this depth and breadth out there that you can, use to supplement what you're doing. You may get some good ideas from one of the other ones, and, it becomes, like I said, with that blueprint analogy, you would generally, a lot of people will look at different houses. My my stepmother is just huge into watching all the housing shows, goes to the realtor sites and has the Zoom now where they can roam around. And, in her mind, she has a dream house built, and it's this bedroom, that bathroom, this, and that's kind of what we're going to do when we put together a security policy, or even if we update one. If a company's been around for 20 years, and then either just an annual event comes up or we merge with somebody, now we've got to go through this whole process again. And so these are our resources to make life a lot easier. So that's all I do with 7, because there's just those are sort of the big ones. NIST, ISO, there's Corbett. I didn't mention Corbett. Corbett's kind of a business group one, business association. And so, but it's one of the things that is nice. Thankfully, this is not a brand new thing completely. There's people been doing this for a lot of years. There's a lot of, and even though it's still a growing and evolving and maturing space, there are these frameworks out there that can help us, and we're not starting from scratch. Now, as we move into lesson 8 is on threat actors in detail, as it's called. And really what it is there's really 2 big parts. One, we identified the threat actors and different types of attacks in the first week in lesson 2 or 3. And we talked about script kiddies and, the various criminal layers of criminal hackers. And we talked about activists, hacktivists, and different types of classifications. Well, really the big part that sort of builds on in this lesson is to go a little bit deeper into sort of their threats and motivations, and their resourcing. Obviously a script kiddie, as I joke, a new one born every year at Christmas. So we have a new crop. We have some new script kiddies. They download some hack tools. They start playing around. Maybe they're hacking their friend's Minecraft server or knocking them off of Fortnite, whatever they're doing. And then, and funny enough, I had a conversation with one of our other new students, and when I was talking about some of this, they were like, "That's funny. That's kind of exactly how I got started to some of this." So I mean, it's not made up. This is what happens. And then some of them get bored and move on, but some keep at it. And then there's a branch at some point. Some kind of just keep diving in that darker web. And others will go on to classes and programs and cyber patriot leagues and things like that. And we have that split. But, the script kiddies generally have a computer. That's kind of part of it. But they've downloaded some off-the-shelf stuff. But they're not very sophisticated yet. They usually don't have any resources, money or additional technology they're not writing custom, or not even modifying attacks, let alone writing custom attacks towards you. But then as you start to move up the pathway, then obviously that changes. Now there are the exceptions. A hacktivist could be not much better than a script kiddie. Like that's not uncommon. Somebody learns a little bit, and then the first thing they do is go hack for a cause. So they're still not very experienced. Some of the members of Anonymous at the time, some were, some weren't, experienced. And other types of hacktivist groups. You can find, any conflict in the world, Palestinian, Israeli, Ukraine, rebels, Russia, whatever, and you'll find hackers that are, whether official or not, are hacking, if nothing else, for propaganda. ISIS and all that, they had their own group of propaganda and social media, and lots of people in other parts of the world were trying to take their sites down all the time. So these kind of games. And so you start to get into this as you step up these categories, more resources, more skill, because one, you've gotten away with it, you've learned, or you've been taught, or you've learned on the forums, you've met some mentor, and they're kind of taking you under their wing. You're getting better tools. Maybe you're beginning to customize a little bit, just customize an attack, not just run its default. Maybe tweak something. Still probably not anything, for the most part, totally custom, like written from scratch. But you may have some resources, because if you've been successful in hacking, you may now have control of some other machines or servers. You've infected them with malware. You've got your own little botnet. So as that starts to happen, now you can route your attacks through different places and hide and obfuscate who you are. And so, and of course, as you go further and further up and you start to get into, and we're going to see even in a later class, we'll come back, because in some ways, criminal hackers is too broad. It's true, but they run the gamut from just barely beyond script kiddie to sending out their first spam kind of clickbait emails to make a little money, or start taking over a few bots to learn, to move that way, to obviously nation state, not nation state, but just groups. Like one of my favorite cases of this, it may be in our channel. I can't remember if I posted it there. I think I did, but there is this story I read earlier this year, late last year, that was a really elaborate hack that these folks had done. And it was a whole criminal conspiracy going on. I mean, and they really had formed their own enterprise. There were a handful of these hackers that formed this group. And what they were doing was, and you probably know how this works, but like when a company is going to announce a merger, they're going to announce their quarterly results, they're going to announce a trial from a new drug, whatever it is, then they can't, if there's some rule about when that goes out, they can't magically have marketing get everything done at that moment. So they do it early, and then they'll put it with somebody like the PR Wire or one of those types of sites, and they'll put it in digital escrow, and then on the date and time, midnight, whatever it is, then that release will go out and tell the world. And that way, ideally, there's no insider information. The whole market has public, pure information. So this group had figured out how to hack into those PR sites, and were able to get into their escrow information, and thus for days, sometimes weeks, had advanced knowledge of a merger about to happen or not, a trial that was approved, a drug that made it through trial or got rejected, all these different points that, you're nodding away. So I see you get it. If you know that before the stock market does, you can make money out of that. That's the whole point of insider information. So now they're hackers, so they weren't exactly sure what to do. I guess, and they could have done it maybe themselves, but what they did instead was partner with, around the world, a group of shady brokers who would trade on their own account. And then they had to pay like a 30% commission of the profits that they were making back to these hackers. And, as they grew, they had their own like support team. They had 3 or 4 core guys that were doing the core hacking. They had people doing collecting, and I mean, they had built this little criminal enterprise. They had a company. They were kind of virtual, but we do that too in the real, non-gray world. So they were working from different places. And I thought one of the most fascinating parts is that at one point, so many months, but so many months into their operation, and they're making lots of money, millions of dollars. They're very happy with themselves, of course. And the PR, at least like PR Wire, one of the bigger ones in the world's figured out, oh my God, something's going on here. and they shut them out. So whatever that company had done to put in a new defense, new software, new encryption, whatever, the three original founders of this little criminal enterprise, they couldn't figure it out. So they went out and hired somebody who could. They literally just, because they only got, now you see what I mean? Now we have resources. We're an enterprise. A client of mine here in Texas that became a client after this event, they got, and I'll talk about it in another class another time, but they got a very targeted spearfish, fell for it, installed something, and then they captured bank credentials and started stealing money from them. And when we traced all this stuff back and, did the malware analysis and everything else, we found that as far as Norton, they were the only people, Symatech, that knew anything about this signature at all at the time. And they were attributing them to some Eastern European gang, but that's about as far as they could narrow it down. And these guys were professional. And I say guys, girls, young, old, whatever, wherever they were, because the way they wrote their software is it actually had its own, like if you had gotten their software on your computer, Ben, you would have never known it. 48 hours after you got it, it would have completely and thoroughly removed itself from your system because you're not their target. And it would have seen that, and even if it just bad luck happened to be a long weekend, like maybe it infected somebody Friday and nobody did any transactions, it would delete itself. They don't care. They update it almost every day, a slight tweak to their algorithm and their obfuscation techniques within the malware packet, and they don't want it to hang around and get caught by Norton and Microsoft and all these guys and get in the databases. And they don't do anything else. They're not going to, some of the off-the-shelf malware that some of the script kiddies get to playing with to infect somebody, because somebody else wrote that and you're not sure what you're getting, you may be thinking, okay, my target is to put this backdoor and watch for keystrokes. But because you've used this injector that's a third-party tool out there, they may put other stuff. And a lot of times viruses just go insane. They just start downloading more and more things and new pop-ups happen and there's stuff in the registry, there's stuff here. But the more sophisticated folks don't do that, because then that's going to get that machine wiped and they're not going to have that resource. They want to be more laser focused on getting in and taking it over. We're going to send spam. We're going to get in. We're going to look for certain bank logins. Or we're going to get in and do this. So as you move up the chain, the more, criminal guys, not only do they have a lot of skill, but they have money now. They can go hire other people. They can go out on the dark web and buy tech. They can go out and buy various lists. And of course, as you move up to the highest end of things, you get into the nation state players who are obviously resourced. They have government money, even if they're not NSA/GRU, whatever the agency of that government is, even if they're kind of like two or three of the main concern APTs out there, advanced persistent threats, and they number them 1 through, I don't know what number we're up to now, but I was reading a report about actually some of the, in the last 3 or so years, 4 years, America has particularly begun to start indicting some of these criminal hackers, Chinese, Russian, Syrian, Iranian. And there was a whole article about what that was doing. We're not arresting many. Is it really accomplishing anything? But it had this nice chart, and it had one of the first they ever charged was a Chinese group, APT-1, and then later after a bunch of others, there was APT-10 in there. But the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, lots of players are these very advanced players, and whether, like I said, whether they physically reside at a government installation like Langley, Virginia for the CIA, or the NSA, Maryland for the NSA, whatever they are, or they're just a group of hackers that has some plausible deniability in some other warehouse, but they're still being resourced, then we're at the top of the pool. We've got access to things like, we've had two big things that have happened in the last few years. We had Snowden leak some slides and all that information about what the NSA and the CIA, what they were doing, the types of operations. But probably more damning than that was the shadow brokers leak of the NSA tools like Internal Blue and some of these other attacks that, now that they're out there in the wild, The Russians have used them, the Chinese have used them, the North Koreans used them in their attack on Sony. These are tools that that were developed at a very high end over as 0-day exploits that the NSA hadn't told Microsoft or anybody about, so they could keep them around. So you kind of see that across that spectrum, there are exceptions. You might have a hacktivist who's very, very skilled and very resourced, but kind of an anomaly for most, when they're probably more middle tier hackers more times than not. You're not going to usually find an APT with script level of script kiddie resources, and you're not going to find a script kiddie getting an ATT number and assigned to them because they're just not good enough. So there is generally this progression, but it can take a number of different pathways, and depending upon. And because of, the reason we want to understand that, one of the things that I tell people in our program and when I talk about security is that if you do the basic right things, the best practices, don't use default passwords, do X, Y, and Z, block, harden your services, do this. You can eliminate 80% of this crap because a lot of this is script kiddie or even lower level gang and lower level automatic attacks. You can just get these out of your hair. And so you're really only worried about sort of the mid to higher level criminal gangs is what most people have to be aware of all the time. And then depending on where you work, what your company is, if you're a Google, if you're a defense contractor, if you're certain things, then yes, you got to be aware and be prepared to defend against these advanced persistent threat, these government actors. But if you're, Joe's Pizza, and even if you have 20 franchises, all across multiple states, and you're a multi-million-dollar company, probably none of them are trying to hack you. Like, what is your secret sauce pizza recipe that the Chinese want so bad? Does that, that's not likely. So like we've said before, and we're going to talk a little bit about it as we get into the last chapter here in a minute, all of this cybersecurity knowledge, all these things we do, all these controls, all this theory, all these principles, all these layered defenses, they are all uniquely done for each organization based on an analysis of the risks that organization face. And so Joe's Pizza, even if we have 20 locations in 20 states or, $20 million in revenue, we're probably not worried about Chinese or Russian hackers. We could be a small little company in the middle of nowhere, but we're a defense subcontractor for a subcontractor. And yes, maybe the Russians are coming. So each entity, has to make its own decision. What markets are we in? What products do we have? You could be, sitting on a lot of data. That's why the tech and the, the networks and things like that are so popular. One of the things that has been speculated is that there's this big speculation in the industry right now that all of the major players, the Chinese, the Americans, the Russians, etc., Europeans, I guess, too, British, everybody is scooping up all of this data from breaches, all of this communication, and even though it's encrypted, they're scooping it up because we're probably only so many years away from practical quantum computers, which is then going to mean in 5-10 years that they can go back and unlock all of that stuff that they've been sitting on for so many years. And that's going to be interesting. And there's a lot of talk that the Chinese particularly, and I'm not trying to pick out, you've heard me I can list a country everywhere. They're all over that, that are, and we do it too. Everybody does it. It's just a game. It's sort of the modern, spies and statecraft game now. It's all more done digitally. But, the Chinese apparently have been trying to gather up, of course, not only just, trade secrets and defense secrets to improve their military and grow to challenge America in the Pacific, but just scooping up all kinds of information. And there's some argument that some people are afraid that they're scooping up so much information that it's then when you start to put sort of machine learning analysis on that data, you can start to figure things out. And sometimes it's not even that complex. I don't know if you've heard this story, but there was a number, I think it's the Danish, or maybe the Norwegians, one of those up there in the northern, close to Russia, northern NATO allies. some researchers did some research, and basically they outed a bunch of Russian spies because there was like the Russian car registry was publicly accessible, and they went and scooped up a bunch of data, and then correlating that with other data and the address of the GRU's office building, they found all these cars that were registered there, and ended up being able to out these spies. And of course, we had an app not too long ago, I can't remember its name, but it's one of those fitness apps that they made a big story how there was like maps of bases that people didn't even know were in that part of Iraq or Afghanistan or Africa, wherever. But because some soldier had that app and was running around the perimeter of the base, now we have a map of where that person was and why was that person in the middle of whatever. And you piece a few things together. Now there's a base there, there's patterns, So all this big data is going to be a challenging thing for us as we go on. But now the other aspect, though, beyond talking about threat actors in detail and their motivations, resources, skills, experience, is the other big part of lesson 9 is the introduction of what we call non-human threat actors. It's one of the things that I kind of pound on a little bit when I talk in our classes because, I mentioned in the first week that we have to handle confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we have a tendency in our field sometimes to forget about availability because we're so worried about locking the data down and stopping the hackers and putting up our firewalls and all that. And so the same thing, we can get so focused on the hackers that we forget that we actually have in that availability promise a much broader set of availabilities we have to be responsible for. We're protecting that data. If a hacker steals it, that's bad. We've failed. If the data center burns down and no one has a backup, that's still on us. That's not IT. I mean, they may implement the backup, but that's cybersecurity. We don't have the policy in place. We haven't thought that through. And so you have to start thinking about all of the possibilities. And in the broadest sense, you can say it's anything that like an insurance company would call an act of God. All those things that get, that aren't covered, or if they are, there are limitations maybe, but, war and famine and floods and hurricanes and fires and on and on and on and on. And you really don't have to look too far to see examples where, the impacts are huge. Sure, storms come through all the time. We'll have a little power outage, something will happen. You might get a spike and lose a piece of equipment. Those happens to all of us, and we generally deal with it. Or worst case, we go out to Best Buy, we buy the new TV, because the lightning got us. But in the corporate world, we can't, necessarily be down for the, days that it takes before we could go buy that new piece. And so we have to do a lot of analysis and think about those things. And so I always, not joke, but semi-joke, but seriously say, if you live in Florida, if your office is in Florida, your data center is in Florida, and you don't plan for hurricanes, you're a fool. If you live in Oklahoma, Oklahoma even now, but I really meant California, you better take into account earthquakes. If it's Oklahoma, North Texas, the plains, flooding, tornadoes, these things are real. They happen all the time, and statistically they will happen again. And they, maybe the statistics are still pretty thin. 1 in 1,000. Why do we care? Because if you're that 1,000, you're out of business potentially. And you can look at all kinds of incidences. Like, obviously 9/11 was an extreme example, but that's something you have to keep in mind. There are companies, and there are actually all kinds of personal stories and all that. But there are some interesting stories of companies that both did and did not survive 9/11. And there are the small little companies there that was it. 5 people in an office in that trade center. They all died. Everything was destroyed. There's nothing. 2 companies, like some of the major trading companies, including one of the worst hit trading companies in that building, they continued. They survived. They lost like half of their staff, and yet that company made it through. That company had data centers in other places. They were able to shunt to a New Jersey facility and start processing. Arguably, New Jersey might have been too close in certain capacities at their backup, but for that accident, that was plenty far away, right?
Mm,
Or not accident, for that attack, for that that incident, what I meant to say.
mm,
Um, so we have to look at all those non-human threat actors and really put them into account. And you can look at, there's always extreme examples. When you think about hurricanes, for example, I'm born in Texas, North Texas, so it wasn't what I was brought up with, but we moved around a lot, and I ended up in Houston. And I was in Houston when Alicia came over Houston, and it was as a young kid, high school, but still I'll never forget it, because it was still a category 1 as it came through town, and was still had an eye, and that eye went right over my house, north of Houston. And that was an amazing experience to have storm. And then my brother and I and my father walk out, look up, see the sky, lightning flickering on the walls of the eye, birds flying around, beautiful sun. And then the house across the street disappeared as we backed into our house, and here came the other wall, and then we're back in the storm again for a long time. Amazing experience. I wish that I had like I do today, smartphones and cameras. It would have been a great thing to have not just have in my mind's eye, but to take a few pictures of. But that was cool as a kid, except that we didn't have power for a week and a half, and we lived in a nice part of Houston. I mean, it didn't matter wealthy or not. Think about New Orleans. That impact. I lived there too. The place I lived was underwater. I lived down from one of the levees on the east side of New Orleans, in a nice gated community, middle class neighborhood again, and flooded. And then that whole town just went to hell. I mean, everything fell apart. So, once again, lots of companies didn't make it. Some of it's because they were damaged, they didn't have insurance, whatever. But some of it's because the market didn't come back for a while, they couldn't last that long. But others, just because of that week or two, that's what killed them. They weren't prepared to keep serving and serving their clients, paying their bills, doing what they needed to do. So we have to take that into account. And that sort of takes us into our last lesson of this class, which is the organizational security lesson. And when you get down to it, what we're trying to do when we take everything we learn from this class is this sort of brings it up. We're taking all this knowledge. We know what the possible attacks and vectors are, at least high level. We'll learn more. We kind of get the idea of who these players can be, even taking into account non-human players, other types of things that can be disruptive to our organization and to the availability of that information. And so we're then, we've learned about, the different frameworks we can use to help guide this, some of the different things like controls, people, products, and policies to put into place, all these different kind of concepts. And so in 10, we look further at controls because, as I said a week or so ago, everything we do, we call a control. So if we put a password policy in place, that's a control. We generally would think of that as a policy control or administrative control. Mm-hmm. If we put that 3 times you mess up your password in place and it locks you out, that reinforces that password policy. That's a technical control that goes with that procedural control to give us layered defenses, right? Mm-hmm. And you can apply that to all the different tech and all the different policies we're going to write. Here's the policy on how we fill out a firewall, how we set up a firewall. Here's the policy of how we configure our IDS. Here's our network topology and our layered defenses. And so the chapter talks about preventative controls, detective controls, corrective controls. So that's one classification type that you might see on a test or something where they'll say, here's a control, what type is it? So does it act to prevent before the incident? Does it act at the moment of the incident, detective, or is it more corrective? It's going to do something after the event. But then you also have another classification, which is more to do with sort of how the control does its work. Is it a physical control like a lock? Okay, that's is it a technical control like we mentioned, the technology piece? Is it a procedural control? On and on. And you don't have to memorize all those, but it is good to know those broad because those are the pretty 2 common ways that, as a matter of fact, you'll see on the CompTIA Security Plus exam that they specifically break out controls to understand controls by those 2 sets of classifications in a sense. But then the rest of 10 is about, okay, we get that. Okay, we got that last week, Lee. It's a control. We stick controls in. But the question is how? Which ones, right? What are we doing and what level and what depth? And that's where the sort of what I consider the biggest piece. Now, the whole business continuity piece I'll finish up with in a minute is important too. But probably the biggest piece of lesson 10, and we've mentioned it before, it'll be mentioned again and again, it'll come back in a couple other classes, but is the whole risk management / risk assessment piece. This is sort of the first exposure to it, because it's what drives making our security policy for our organization different. So you and I can both be pizza restaurants, and you're going to have a different one than me because you serve different states. You have different maybe you have a loyalty program and I don't, so you've got a lot of personal information on these people. Whatever, each organization is going to have to take a look at their own situation and then do one of two types of risk analysis. We can do what we call a qualitative risk analysis, which is really better than nothing, but still the lower, so that's sort of like, okay, using this analogy I just kind of threw together here, Ben's got a pizza place, Lee's got a pizza place, but Ben's pizza place has this loyalty program. So he's probably going to rank the loss of that personal data pretty high. So that's the qualitative assessment. I'm going to rank that as a high risk to me. If I lose that, that's bad. I'm going to piss off all my people. And I'm like going, don't have any personal information, very low risk, right? And then on and on, we can do that. Okay, we both have websites. Maybe we put a medium. We both have XYZ, somebody. And then but while qualitative is better than nothing, you're basically kind of doing that low, medium, high, maybe you have 5 categories, whatever, but you're just kind of gut categorizing it. It's better than nothing than just willy-nilly trying to go out and design your strategy or not do anything by the seat of your pants.
Right.
But what you really want to do is a qualitative analysis. You have a question or something?
Well, I was just going to make a comment that in that context, when I've done with the security stuff in the past, is looked at it from a systems perspective, and looked almost like at these various methods as experiments, like almost like A/B testing,
Okay.
where you would assign different parts, different strategies to see which would work best in the different areas, and to sort of manage risk.
Well, I see what you're saying. It's sort of like doing risk what if analysis, right? Is what
you're saying. Right. And you have like A/B, so that at the most you're risking maybe half of your your whatever, and you could divide it and try different ways. Yeah.
Well, it's almost like with that, you're getting, if you just do the simplest one pass kind of low, medium, high rank qualitative analysis, it's better than nothing. But yeah, doing the sort of multiple variant version of it, even if you keep it at qualitative, you're doing kind of it's almost like you're doing 2-layer qualitative, because you've got sort of because a lot of times when we do that kind of analysis, we're doing it based on what is the low, medium, and high probability of a certain outcome, right? There's a probability in there. So, that could be done. You could say, okay, I'm going to do my low probability qualitative in this, my high probability, and you could end up making more average, do a matrix, and that would be better than just that one pass qualitative, or quantitative, or no, qualitative. Is that right? First time.
Yeah.
But then ideally, what you really want to do is take what you're doing and go all the way to qualitative, quantitative, and now we want to do math to it. And then you can do 3 layers of those too, or whatever you want to do. And so there's even an exercise in here. It's very simple. I kind of made it up. It's like an organic lemonade stand or something, but they've got a website. They sell some merchandise. They sell some product. You got to do some math to sort of figure out, how you would rank some of their risk. But that's what organizations have to do. Two relatively on the surface, the layman would say identical places. When you really look in there, they're going to have a lot of differences based on their employees, their technology. Maybe I got newer tech, you got older tech. Well, that's a bigger risk for you than me, right? You're having to deal with legacy equipment. You've been around longer. Maybe the different geographical areas we operate in present different challenges and risk. And so every organization needs to do this risk assessment, risk analysis of their own organization. And you can do that in numerous different ways. One of the best is sort of, especially as it ties into some of what we call business continuity planning,
right.
is to take a look at things and say, hypothetically, what if X went the hell away? What if we lost the website? What if we lost the sales database? What if our accounting software went down? On and on and on. I mean, and and that can apply to other things too. Our security system, our warehouse, our logistics, whatever. They're all valid in the context, even if you don't directly seem security related. Well, you're inventorying all the inventory, right? There's a digital piece. We got to look at all this, and we're ultimately trying to enable the organization. So, if we let data fail in any capacity and the organization fails, then we got to go find new jobs and we don't get toys to play with anymore. So we want to enable the organization and do it. And so, as part of, taking a look at that, then it allows us, in doing that kind of analysis, it allows us to start saying, okay, well, if the website's down, we can put some money to that. What is the business impact analysis? Do a BIA, business impact analysis of that. Okay, the website's down. Well, maybe my little pizza restaurant, I just have my map and my menu, but you with your loyalty program and discounts and an app and all kinds of stuff, if your website's down, then that's going to be a much higher impact, whether that's just a high or better yet, what's really going to happen is we're going to know. You're going to have some idea. I sell X number of pizzas a day, like Amazon. I make a gazillion bucks a minute on my website. So obviously Amazon's willing to put a lot of money into keeping their websites up and keeping their databases up and keeping their backend. Not to mention, you could almost say screw Amazon, because Amazon Web Services powers so much of the web now that they make almost more money from that side of the business than selling all the damn goods. But that's how that company formed, because they, had to have enough capacity to handle Christmas, to handle Black Friday and the few weeks around there. And then the rest of the year, they didn't need that much. They fell back to a more average month of, Mother's Day sure would pop up a little bit, but just, that they're like any other retailer. So then they could resell that capacity. And now that's become arguably one of the biggest parts of their business. The rest is almost like they could stop selling and still be a billions of dollar company. So they, have a very vested interest in keeping their technology up and running. And so they have literally thousands of staff around the world whose job is exactly what we're talking about, to do those analysis, to monitor those systems, and to keep those systems up and running. Me, I get so many visitors a day. I know that, every day I get a couple of new clients that maybe some kind of tracking tells me at least one of those came from the website. So, and then I know that my average meal is $40 for a couple or family that comes in. So if my website's down for a day, I lose $40 a day. If Amazon's website's down for a tenth of a second, they lose $40 million. So that's the kind of analysis that we do, but not just for the website, for the database, for the accounting, the data center, on and on and on. And then we can look at, okay, now that we see, we can live without that for a little while, but that we can't, then that's going to be what we need to put our effort into, to protecting or backing up, or we get into the whole disaster recovery, business incident response kind of at the end of this lesson about, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to do that? If that data center just burned to the ground, well, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to have some other type. Today in the cloud, when you spin up things in Amazon or Azure, you can tell it, I want to put here, and you can put it in different places so that you can geographically serve the world. And if some, terrible natural disaster took out a data center in the Northwest or wherever, then you would still have other capacity. But even if you're not going that far, okay, we've got our in-house data center. It's racks and racks of servers and websites and databases. Well, we better have some way to bring this back up if this goes down. If we're in Florida, particularly, a hurricane comes in and power's off for 2 weeks, we may be out of business before we can get this facility back up, even if it doesn't flood out. So what do? If it's so important to us, we may have to have a warm site, a live hot site, where we have another site on the other side of the world that is replicating in real time, ready to go at instantaneous notice. But it also could be that we just need to have a shell somewhere and we can take that equipment or bring some off the shelf and then restore the backups. But we have to look at certain things like there's some concepts. We don't really talk about them as much in here. I believe they're mentioned, but they show up in some of the later stuff. And but it's sort of like one of them is called mean time to recovery. So what is your plan to recover? And then you have a tolerance limit for that too. In other words, how long can we stand to be down? And then you have to bring these together. So if you can only stand to be down a day and your mean time to recovery is 4, that's no good for your company because you're already out of business at that 1 day mark, or you've irreparable damage. So we either have to figure out how to stretch our tolerance or lower our mean time to recovery. And so this type of analysis drives all of this type of planning. It ultimately, risk analysis drives almost everything we do in cybersecurity. How big is the risk to X? So are we putting in 3 layers or 12 layers? Are we going to put, how important is that data? How granular are we going to access controls? We're going to grant those. How important is it to get these facilities, these databases, this processes back up and running? That's going to determine warm, cold, hot sites and whether we have people staffed there 24/7 or somebody's just going to get the call when we see the hurricane coming. We go ahead and start spinning that up. And we're going to have to do that based on what are the risks we face, all the way from the thing we started with, the criminal hackers, all the way down the line to the non-human threat actors that could impact us. And you need to take into account all of them. But there are some exceptions. Like if you're in the middle of, South Dakota, you probably don't have to worry about hurricanes. I've never seen a hurricane make it that far. Now, does that mean weather's not a problem? No. Think about the snowstorms and the floods of the Mississippi sometimes. There are different things that have totally screwed them, the upper Midwest, and for days and weeks. So you have to plan for those, right? With the boom of oil and shale oil, some kind of, Exxon Valdez kind of, big explosion, disaster on the rail lines. I mean, anything like that, if it impacts your area, where are you at? There's not much we could do about it, but in Austin, I remember when I went to UT as a kid, I got the tour of the campus. And then after we'd done this tour, we'd come back to this kind of one of the fountains off the quad, and we were all sitting around there, and the tour guy was like, and this main tower building here, if you're ever sitting on this and you look up and you see an ICBM coming in, that's because in the basement we have one of the major supercomputer centers, 5 in this country, that helps NASA control all the satellites and everything. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, great. I thought I thought when I left Houston for Austin, maybe I was getting out of a major target. But no, of course. So, if that happens, maybe it's all bets off. But, if it's a true, ending, the dinosaur killer meteor comes back, it's probably not going to matter. But short of those things, we need to plan. One nuclear missile somehow, like the movies say, goes off rogue or technical, some other natural disaster. I mean, there was that huge chemical explosion in, Bhopal, India, back years ago, killed thousands and thousands of people. If you live in Houston, all that crap's there. They're pretty good at it. Probably that won't happen, but there's no guarantee that, some chain of events, terrorists or otherwise, could cause a major problem, and you got to factor that into your plan. So that is pretty much the last of that. I'm going to double check my notes, make sure I'm not forgetting. I got some on the side here too. Well, I guess the one thing, I mentioned it very briefly, but another piece that comes out of this in the organizational security is what we call incident response planning. You'll have an incident response team of some kind, usually, especially a sizable enough organization. Now, just like you plan for all these things, you're going to have to determine, when is an incident big enough that we have to launch the incident response team? What is the communication pathway to tell those people that? And so that could be a virus outbreak that affects one office is big enough that we got to send the team in and clean that up. That's not disaster recovery per se. It's not like to the level that we're firing up hot sites, but usually you will see an incident become potentially big enough or, escalate out of hand to then potentially launch a disaster recovery plan. Or you sometimes, at least with hurricanes and a few things, have some kind of warning. We know it's coming. It's time to shut these machines down, spin these up, send everybody home. bring in the temp staff, whatever we need to do, put some people on a plane to that other data center, whatever and you can start to fire those off in advance. Sadly, for an earthquake and other things, you're not going to get any warning, so you got to have the plan in place with that in mind. But there are incidences, crypto malware, a virus incident, a physical break-in in a facility would be an incident that you need to respond with your team. Somebody broke into our data center. We don't just need to call the cops and throw another lock on. We need to go see if they did anything while they were in there, right? That's an incident that we need to not just say, call the cops, file a report. No, they were in there. As I always say, if I can touch your stuff, I own it. So if I know somebody got into my facility, we're going through all that with a fine-tooth comb to make sure they didn't leave stuff, plugged in USB sticks and various other things. So as we finish up this class, we switch gears for the next one. We'll go into network foundations. As I've said before, it's kind of a little bit of review of networking with a particular focus on Linux instead of, say, the Windows world, and particularly exposing you guys to the technology we're going to use, VirtualBox and GNS3 for the virtual networks. And so you'll build some VMs, play around with some networking, and then you'll build some topologies, play around with that networking. And you'll find that unlike this one, as I promised, this is the only completely consocial course in the course. You get hands-on from here on out, and we kind of bounce back. This is a pretty heavy hands-on in the next one. So any questions?
No, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Ben. I've got another one after this for the Network Foundations class that's going on. And then I actually have a webinar that I do about once a month for the marketing team to kind of bring more people into the program. So I'll be doing that at 2. So it'll probably be mid-afternoon or so before I get these posted. But of course, you've seen it, so no big deal. But for the rest of the folks, that's when that'll happen later this afternoon. And then you and I meet a little later for a one-on-one, I think, today, right?
Yeah,
okay.
yes, that's right.
All right. Well, then you have a good one. I'm going to let you go, take a 5-minute break, and then start the next one. And I'll
okay. Have a good one.
Bye.